Good morning. Thank you for joining me. Elizabeth May, I'm leader of the Green Party of Canada. I'm joined today by John Bennett, Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada. Malheureusement, il y a les autres députés qui ont pensé que c'est possible pour eux de m'ajoigner ce matin, mais évidemment, les autres députés sont occupés avec les autres choses. But I do have Jean-François Fortin of the Bloc Québécois had wanted to be here. Bruce Heyer, independent from Thunder Bay Superior North, had wanted to be here. Bruce Heyer has prepared his own press release, which we are distributing there to also make the same major points of this press conference. Let me explain. On February 15th, Friday, quietly tabled in the House of Commons, was Environment Canada's 2012 progress report on the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. Building on the same numbers that they released in the greenhouse gas inventory of August of this year, they have quietly, and it's quite bizarre, they've quietly confirmed that there is absolutely no chance of Canada meeting the Copenhagen targets. Now, just to back up, and we do have details available in a backgrounder of the various targets that Canada has chosen to adopt. The first and most important were the Kyoto targets. They were adopted as a legally binding treaty, and I think everyone knows that Canada has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol, which was, as I said, a legally binding treaty. The first time in the history of Canada that we've ever withdrawn from a treaty we have ratified. Backing up from there, that target was 6% below 1990 levels to be achieved by 2012. There was a plan in place. It was approved by the Paul Martin government in the spring of 2005. It was backed up by substantial budgetary measures in the budget of 2005. In early 2006, newly sworn-in Prime Minister Stephen Harper canceled all plans to meet Kyoto and announced we had no intention of trying. He then put forward a target that was 20% below 2006 levels by 2020. Subsequently, in Copenhagen, at the large conference that was supposed to come up with a treaty, it was a tragic failure of many governments from around the world. But at that conference, that was the first time that Stephen Harper personally attended a multilateral summit on climate change, and he personally adopted the same target as the United States. Now, this had the effect of once more weakening Canada's target. So the Copenhagen target, personally adopted by Stephen Harper in a meeting with President Barack Obama, is 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. Now, there's some difficulties with Environment Canada's numbers in that Environment Canada has put out two different numbers for that baseline of what 2005 levels are. And it's a constant, I'll be constant in my references. For purposes of this morning, I'm going to use their first number, 740 megatons in 2005. But just so you know, there's a number floating out there of 731 megatons in 2005, for which, of course, the drop would be 17% to 731. 17% of 740 is 126. This is basic math. So under Stephen Harper's watch, under his own commitment, he must, by 2020, ensure that Canada drops 126 megatons below the 2005 level. And we have heard in the House of Commons ad nauseum that they're halfway to their Copenhagen target. It's not true. They're not close. And these are their own numbers. Even though the text on this page says we're on track, the numbers say that by 2020, Environment Canada expects our emissions to be 720 megatons. Another reference point to note, in 2010, a number for which they trumpet their success in reducing emissions, Canada was emitting 692 megatons. So from 2010 at 692, by 2020, the due date, emissions will have risen substantially to 720 megatons. And for some reason, Peter Kent says he finds this encouraging. The only thing that reduced our emissions to the 2010 level of 692 megatons was a worldwide recession. So whenever Stephen Harper, Michelle Rempel, and Peter Kent stand up and say they're the only government that ever succeeded in reducing emissions, and that it was on their watch and by their plan, the only thing one can conclude is that they orchestrated the global recession. because that's the only thing that ever reduced emissions. And as soon as the recession was over, emissions have been rising. So we are not only not achieving a Copenhagen target, we are not only not even close to halfway, we will have reduced by 2020 20 megatons out of a target of 126 megatons. And I defy anyone to find the new math that makes 20 megatons half of 126. And I will further point out that being halfway to your target on the day the target falls due is called missing the target. It's called failure. And the fact that when I put this to Stephen Harper in question period this week, all I could say is we're making progress on this file requires a press conference to say the emperor is naked. John Bennett.
It's been my pleasure to follow Elizabeth many times. I think what's really important about this story is what's about to happen. Because of statements by John Kerry, the Secretary of State in the U.S., and by the U.S. Ambassador to Canada about the need for Canada to improve its environmental standard, we're about to see a huge parade of factoids coming out of the federal government talking about how it has been doing great things in terms of cleaning up the environment, and the Americans should not be considering demanding anything more. This is the fundamental issue of climate change, which is the one that we'll be talking the most about, and the government of Canada is presenting a plan that doesn't work, and trying to sell numbers that show failure as success. They're going to continue to run these things out over the next few months in their attempt to save the XL pipeline. If Canada wants to convince the United States that we're actually taking climate change seriously, we need to have some real regulations, and we have to have them in the very short term. We don't need a lot more rehashing of misinformation, and which is what we get from this government whenever we talk about the environment. Thank you.
Pour terminer, je veux seulement faire un petit résumé en français, parce que avec l'inaction des conservateurs de Harper pour réduire les gaz à effet de serre, nous avons maintenant absolument épreuve dans le rapport au Parlement de 15 février que le plan de M. Harper, c'est vraiment un échec. Il n'est pas possible avec ces nombres de réduction de gaz à effet de serre. À ce moment, nous avons une grande croissance de gaz à effet de serre vers 720 millions de tonnes à 2020. Ce n'est pas une cible réalisée par le gouvernement M. Harper, mais c'est vraiment, il a absolument ignoré la crise de changement climatique, et avec tous les efforts, la seule chose qui a résultat dans une réduction de gaz à effet de serre, c'est la grande crise économique de 2008. À cause de ça, nous avons les réductions de gaz à effet de serre en 2010. Mais par 2020, le gaz à effet de serre sera encore plus haut que maintenant. It's hard talking about numbers and targets and how we've missed targets, but I note that we seem to be able to grasp numbers when we talk about the price of the F-35s. I think it's important that we begin to grasp numbers when we're talking about the science that tells us that we are in serious trouble, far more than dealing with Superstorm Sandy or extreme droughts. If we don't get this right in the very short term, we will not be able to control the rising greenhouse gases that come about through runaway global warming and self-accelerating feedback loops. So we have a limited window in which to make a difference. And it appears to me, particularly after my recent trip to Washington, D.C., that President Obama is serious about their target. So while Stephen Harper's been able to cruise for the last 4 years, saying that we're moving in lockstep with the United States because we have the same target as Barack Obama, President Obama seems intent on actually delivering on the U.S. target, while we are sailing again, once again, on a weak target, sailing right past it. If there's a moment before questions, I'm just checking to see if there's any questions. I'd received this from a counselor in Whitehorse who wanted me to read it at this morning's press conference if there was time. So with your permission, a statement from John Stryker, Whitehorse City Councilor, climate change scientist and professional engineer. It was with deep concern that I read the government's 2012 progress report on greenhouse gas emissions. To begin with, let me note that last year in the Arctic summer sea ice minimum had dropped 50% in the last decade alone, and the volume of sea has dropped 75%. Sea ice in the last decade has dropped 75%. Soon we will be seeing summer sea ice free, and this is a game changer for the North, for Canada, and for the globe. Canada needs to get much more serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In the progress report, the government states half a dozen times that we are halfway to our targets. Reading the data that goes into the report, I find that what they were actually saying is that between now and 2020, they expect absolute emissions to rise. They project that between 2005, when they became the government, and 2020, the target date they reset, we will have dropped emissions by only 20 megatons, or a drop in the bucket. We will fall short of the Copenhagen target, a twice reset and twice weakened target, by 113 megatons. And while it is galling to see them hide behind this information, it is entirely indefensible for them not to take responsibility, to not come up with a plan 7.5 years out to actually meet the target when they have just told us in obscure language that we are failing to meet our goals. Our government needs to do much, much more. John Stryker. So are there any questions? Merci à tout le monde. And thank you. And all of the figures and graphs and charts are available on the Green Party website because it is quite mind-boggling to keep hearing people describe that we are halfway to a target when the numbers they produce show clearly that we are absolutely missing the target and continue to do so right till the day the target falls due. Thank you very much.